All right, welcome back. We're still continuing learning. And in this section, we're moving on from classical conditioning, which was uh, uh, teaching people's behaviors that were limited to either an emotional response, like fear, baby Albert, or a physical reflex, like flinching, or the dog drooling, something that is in an unconscious level being operated and learned, not something that has a wide scope of how you can control other people's behavior. But it set the groundwork for the next type of conditioning, which was operant conditioning. And this one is going to be a little bit different with a wider scope of behaviors that you can train. This time, the person is making the choice to behave in the way that you want them to behave based on the consequence that you give them for their behavior. So in this case, there's no limit to the behavior that you could train, and you'll find operant conditioning in your home with your parents, you'll find it in school with your teachers, you'll find it in job with your employers, you'll find it as a citizen with your government, you'll find it in relationships with your girlfriend or boyfriend or your friends, right? Operant conditioning is used in all of those areas. All right, so what is it? It's the process in which learning occurs as a function of the consequence of the behavior that you exhibit. So if we want you to repeat a behavior, then the consequence has to be a reward. And we're going to talk about what the word reward means in psychology. They actually change it to reinforcement, right? And then if you want the behavior to stop, then the consequence you give is a punishment. It seems very simple to us because we have experienced it our whole life. But up until B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning comes around, we don't understand the principles of how it works and how to use it to control people's behavior. So here we have a study that shows the impact of what using rewards and punishments can do on behavior. So we really focus on using consequences to control people's behavior so that they make a choice consciously of what they're going to do. So when we talk about that, and we're gonna have more information about this before, the consequences that B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning were talking about were reinforcement and punishment. The word reinforcement may be new for us, but it's psychology's version of reward. So we think of reinforcement as a reward, and it doesn't matter what type of reinforcement it is, it's always a reward. So remember that when we get into positive, negative, okay? And remember, it's a consequence that strengthens the behavior that it follows that follows it. Sorry, excuse me. So if you're rewarding a behavior, that behavior is likely to be repeated, right? A punishment is a consequence that is intended to decrease the behavior that it follows, right? So in this case, if we take away your cell phone for bad behavior, we're hoping that you don't do that behavior again, that you connect that bad behavior with unpleasant consequence, and therefore you stop doing the behavior. When we talk about the reinforcement, right, that reward, there is this idea of primary and secondary. And in our mind, when we think of rewards, most of us think of money. But that's actually not a primary reward. We're not naturally inclined to need money. We learn that money can get us what we need, but that takes later on in our life. We are actually born knowing that we need food and water, right? And so that is actually the primary form of reinforcement. It fulfills our basic drives, right? Secondary is anything else that doesn't fulfill a basic drive. It's something that we learn is rewarding. So we learn that we can get things that we need with money. And if we think about it, if you think about the money that you had and the money that you spent, most likely you spent most of it on food or drink, right? Like most humans do. So it really kind of goes back to our basic needs. Before we get into praising B.F. Skinner and all that he did for psychology and the huge impact, his studies may have the biggest impact on human behavior from the psychology field. We have to give props to Edward Thorndike. Edward Thorndike was first thinking about reinforcements when he put a cat in a puzzle box and he had a fish on the outside of the puzzle box. Now, the puzzle box was a perfect thing to use because it controlled the environment. Thorndike knew that the cat would try to escape the puzzle box because it had no other options. The environment was completely sterile, nothing in it, right? The cat was in the box and it was trying to figure a way out. And there was a lever on the outside, and if the cat hit this lever, it opened up the door, and eventually the cat hits the lever, it opens up the door, and the cat goes outside and eats the fish. Now, after the cat is done eating the fish, Thorndike puts it back back in the puzzle box. And if you're thinking your mind with psychology, what should happen next if we talk about learning? Well, of course, the cat immediately went to the lever and opened the puzzle box faster than it did the first time and got the fish. And what we found out was that reinforced behavior will be repeated, and it'll be repeated quicker, right? So we learned that. All right, before we get into more operant conditioning with Skinner, we just acknowledge some commonalities with classical conditioning. These terms mean like the same thing: acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination. They're just applied to operant conditioning. So acquisition is when the learning has occurred. Extinction, if the behavior is no longer rewarded, it will go away. Spontaneous recovery, the learning just pops back even though there's no reward. Stimulus generalization, the behavior is exhibited to different stimuli just to get the reward. Stimulus discrimination, the behavior is only exhibited to a specific stimuli to get the reward. And so these things are sort of in common with classical conditioning, but applied to operant conditioning. Another important term in the scope of operant conditioning is shaping. And if you've been in my classroom, then you've seen the video from Wofford University where they actually have students, freshman students that are studying psychology, conduct an exercise in which they are training lab rats to play rat basketball, right, with tiny balls and putting in a hoop. And we talk about controlling the environment, and we talked about how you had to reward the rat, right, in little incremental steps as it got closer and closer to the behavior of putting a ball into a basket. I mean, that's a very complex behavior. You can't ask a rat to put the ball in the basket and just offer a reward. It won't know what it's doing. Yes, it wants the reward, but it won't know what you want from it to get the reward. So you have to use a process called shaping the behavior to get to this desired complex end that you have in mind. And if you're thinking about the rat basketball video from Wofford, it would be getting the ball into the basket. And so what you do is you reward this rat as it gets closer and closer to your desired end behavior, putting the ball in the basket. It starts with rewarding the rat for just touching the ball and interacting with it. Then you only reward the rat when the ball gets close to the cup. Then you only reward the rat when the ball maybe touches the cup. Then you only reward the rat when the rat picks the ball up and maybe touches the cup. And then maybe with your help, as the rat's picking the ball up and trying to touch the cup, you maybe tip the ball into the cup and then give the rat reward, hoping that the rat now learns that it only gets rewarded when the ball gets in the cup. This is shaping, right, where you are incrementally rewarding the rat in steps to get it to the final sort of complex behavior that you want. And you can do this at home with your pets. If you want a complex behavior that your dog can show, you can reward it in incremental steps to get it to this sort of end desire, like doing a 360 or playing dead or anything else like that. All right, so when we are dealing with animals, especially animals that are not domesticated for long periods of time, or even domesticated animals, we may have an issue of instinctive drift with our learning. And this is when we have biological predisposed patterns of behavior that will pop up no matter what we have learned, right? And so maybe our learned behavior will revert back to our biologically predisposed patterns. In human behavior, we actually call this regressing to the mean. Like if a boyfriend got in trouble with his girlfriend for maybe hanging out with the boys too much, and he promised not to do it anymore, and for 6 weeks he didn't, but then after 6 weeks he kind of went back to his old self. We call that regressing to the mean. Well, in learning, when an animal sort of goes back to its biologically predisposed patterns, we call it instinctive drift. An example is if you taught a pig to take a ball and put it into a basket. If the pig would take the ball and drag it through the mud before it put it into the basket, that might be something that is biologically predisposed in the pig, and there's not anything you can like sort of train out of it. Okay, so Skinner came up with these ideas of operant conditioning. He came up with the ideas of reinforcement versus punishment, and we had the idea of positive and negative, right? So just to really go through and understand these principles of operant conditioning, we have to remind you that reinforcement is a reward, right? It increases the likelihood of a behavior happening again, while punishment, right, is a consequence that decreases the likelihood of the behavior happening again because you don't like it, right? So reinforcement is something that you always like. A punishment is always something that you dislike. But when you're using reinforcements and punishments, the type that you use can be either positive or negative, which is weird because we know that reinforcements are always good So how can there be a negative reinforcement? And the answer is, when we talk positive and negative, we're talking math. We're talking adding and subtracting. So reinforcement, a positive reinforcement, right? You're adding something that somebody likes. A negative reinforcement, you're removing something that they don't like, because that still makes it a reward, right? You're removing something that they don't like, which makes them happy. On the other side, punishment, right? A positive punishment, it's adding something they don't like. Where a negative punishment is removing something that they like, which is still a punishment. So let's get into this wild sort of consequences spectrum here, right? And we see like the stimulus and consequences, and we see the four boxes: top left, positive reinforcement; top right, positive punishment; bottom left, negative reinforcement; bottom right, negative punishment. So a positive reinforcement, right? You're adding something that somebody likes as a reward. So if I give you money for your good grades, that's a positive reinforcement. I added something you didn't have, money, right? As a consequence for the behavior that you did, you're probably going to do that behavior again, okay? For the negative reinforcement, I'm going to take away something that you don't like because that is rewarding to you. So you come home with an A, and I take away your curfew so you can stay up all night, right? Which is probably a bad idea. And that is the consequence for getting an A. You probably will try to get another A so that you can no longer have any curfew, right? What a great removal of something you don't like. We talked about it in class, the seatbelt. The seatbelt, you're rewarded for putting on your seatbelt by the car taking away that beeping noise. It takes away something you don't like. So negative reinforcement is still good, right? It's removing something you don't like, therefore it is rewarding to you. When you go to the when you go to the punishment side, we talk positive punishment. This is still adding something, right? Positive, but you're adding something that the person doesn't like. So if you were to spank someone, a child, for their behavior, right, you're adding a spanking that they didn't have before, and a spanking is something they don't like. That is actually a positive punishment in psychology terms, because you added a consequence that they don't like, right? Negative punishment, right, is where we take away something that they do like as a punishment. So if they get a bad grade, you remove their access to their phone or their car. That removing something that they like to do, using the phone or the car, is a punishment, and that is a negative punishment. All right. Superstitious behavior occurs in humans when they start to think that consequences come from unrelated behaviors. So they close their eyes and cross their fingers while the field goal kicker kicked the game-winning kick, and he made it, and therefore they do it every time because they think it is affecting the outcome of the game, right? So superstitious behavior is just related when we think a great consequence is related to something weird that we did, and therefore we try to keep doing it again and again to result in the same. Another thing that we learned in operant conditioning is a terrible concept called learned helplessness, right? And this is a learning that happens in humans and animals when they're repeatedly exposed to environmental events that they can't avoid. So a terrible example is if a dog is chained and the owner is beating the dog, right? And it does it over and over and over again for weeks or months. It is possible, right, that the dog can be unchained and not leave the situation, even though it's free, and still get beat by the owner because it's learned to just accept its fate. In humans, we can say that in abusive relationships, why people don't leave. If they're stuck in an abusive relationship for a long time, and then it's repeated, and then, they had the opportunity to leave, but they decide not to. A lot of that is just they've become learned and helpless in the sense that they can't control their situation. And a lot of it in students is like if a parent or a teacher constantly helps a student get started and never makes the student try to start on their own, then they can learn their helplessness and their inability to do anything. They're unable to start an assignment, and so they can't do anything until a human comes and helps them get started. This can obviously lead to depression. Feeling that you can't overcome your negative events and your negative situation is definitely a precursor to sort of depressive thoughts, right? The idea that you can't avoid the hopelessness that you're feeling. All right. Now, Skinner was studying operant conditioning his whole life, and he was putting these rats in a cage and pigeons in a cage and all these animals and controlling their environment, which is a huge aspect of it, and monitoring their scheduled behaviors. I mean, their behaviors with schedules of reinforcement, or testing out how you could reward or not reward the animal to see what would occur. And so this led to him discovering these schedules of reinforcement that sort of graphed out the predictable behavior of the learning that you were trying to train into a subject. So at first he came up with two major types of schedules of reinforcement. Now, schedule of reinforcement is how you reward the subject for the behavior that you desire, right? And the first one is continuous. Continuous just means that every time the subject exhibits the behavior that you want, you reward it. Now that is difficult to maintain, but the learning will happen super quick. Think about animals. They learn super quick if you're always reinforcing them with a treat every time they sit or they go to the bathroom outside. That learning will happen very quick. The problem with continuous, and this is what Skinner discovered, is that any period of not rewarding the behavior leads to immediate extinction of the behavior. So the subject stops exhibiting the behavior that you want pretty quickly when you stop rewarding it. Now, on the other hand, Skinner tested out with partial reinforcement, coming up with ways to reinforce the behavior only some of the times when the subject exhibits it, not every single time. This seems to be more maintainable, right? More realistic in a real world and able to do. Also, it sort of creates an expectation of the subject that when they exhibit the behavior that is desired, they may not get a reward at that exact moment, but they still are driven to do the behavior because they know a reward will be coming. And that it sort of leads to two different types of things. Compared to continuous, the learning takes a little bit longer. You're not rewarding it every time the behavior happens, right? So it's going to take a little bit longer for the subject to pick up the learning that you're going to try to be training in it. But when you are not rewarding it, that behavior is still exhibited. So it's more resistant to extinction, right? That the behavior will not go away because the subject has a built-in expectation that not every behavior that they exhibit that is desired will be rewarded, but that a reward should be coming. All right, when we talk about partial reinforcement, there are four types, and they're divided into two categories, ratio and interval. And there's two types of ratio and interval, fixed and variable. So when we talk about reinforcement and we're talking about what that means, when we talk about fixed, that means the reinforcement, the reward is predictable. Okay, and when we talk about variable, that means when the reward is coming is unpredictable. We have no idea when the reward will happen, right? When we talk about ratio and interval, we're talking about the human behavior, the behavior that we desire, that's the ratio, and then versus time passed, and that is interval. So when we put it all together, it makes more sense. A fixed ratio would be a fixed amount of the behavior exhibited will get a reward. So if the behavior that you want to train in the person is buying coffee, and you give them a card that says, you buy 9 coffees, I'll get your 10th one free, and you punch every time they buy a coffee, they know that they have to do the behavior 9 times before they get the reward. So this sort of buy 9, get 1 free is a fixed ratio. You know how many times you have to do it to get the reward. You see a fixed ratio in kindergarten all the time with stars, right? 10 gold stars equals a treasure box, right? And you get a star for doing exhibited behavior that the teacher desires. So that's an example. Variable ratio is different, right? You still have to exhibit the behavior, but you have to do it an unknown number of times before you get a reward, which means, right? Which means that you will get rewarded possibly after the first time you do the behavior. And then after that, there's a chance you get rewarded the second time you do the behavior. Or there's a chance that you could do the behavior 10 times in a row before you get a reward because you don't know when that reward is coming. And the greatest thing is right after you get rewarded, you could get rewarded again. Whereas in fixed ratio, if you bought 9 coffees and got your 10th free, you know you have to buy 9 more coffees before your next reward. In variable ratio, if you're playing the slot machine, and that's lotteries and casinos, and those are variable ratios. Fantasy football, maybe there's some skill in fantasy football. And the idea is you have to play to win. You could win the first time you play, you could win the second time you play, or you could play 15 times, 16, 17 times in a row before you actually win. But if you win, you could actually win the next time you play. And that makes variable ratio much more resistant to extinction, because the expectation is you might not win every time, but when you are going to win sometime, and you're going to have to keep playing, right? And so you have to keep playing to do it. And the next time could be it. And it's really hard to leave the slot machine if you've lost 20 times and you invested so much, right? And you know that that win could be coming the next time, right? You just don't want to leave it. All right. For when it comes to time, there's the fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. Now, this one is you get reinforced after a set amount of time has elapsed. And this one has a really sort of strange response system, because you will have no response, and then right before the reward is coming, you'll see an increased level of response. And an example of this is grades and paychecks. You may see people not picking up hours at all in the first period of their pay period, but as that paycheck is about to be distributed, they start to ask for more hours because they know the reward is coming, and so they start exhibiting more and more the behavior that is required. In grades, it's the same way. We know that in 8 weeks, your report card will come out, right? And so you may not see a strong response of students being very good at their academic work at the very beginning of the grading period, but as they know that grade is about to come out at that set period of time, after 8 weeks has passed, you will see them start to really pick up the steam. And then right in that last week, you'll see them begging for grades and doing everything they can to get the desired grade that they want. And then there's a variable interval, right? And this is when an unknown amount of time has elapsed. You don't know when the reward is coming, you just know that it will come. Now, this one, you don't ever have the behavior being exhibited at extreme rate, because they just don't know when the behavior is coming. Like in fixed ratio, you get faster as you get closer to the reward, and fixed interval, you get faster as you get closer to the reward. In variable ratio, you're always doing it because the reward could be the next time, and you have to keep doing it to get it. But variable interval is like, you know that a certain period of time has to elapse, but you don't know how much that is before you get rewarded. And so an example is a pop quiz, or phishing, or even Instagram post, right? You know that the reinforcement is coming, the fish will bite, the like is coming, the quiz will happen. You just don't know when. And so this is really important to sort of look at as a graph to show the different response rate from the 4 different schedules of reinforcement. So if you look at the top left, we're looking at a fixed ratio. And you know it's a fixed ratio because if you look at the tick marks that show the reinforcement, right, those little diagonal tick marks, they're evenly spaced out. So every certain period of time, they're getting reward. And you also see right next to the tick marks, there's a pause. So those tick marks and fixed ratio, you'll see that the behavior is strong until the reward occurs, but then after the reward occurs, there's a slight pause before they start again. Think about it. If you bought 9 coffees really fast to get your 10th one free, you might not be so inclined to keep buying coffee at that fast rate because you did it to get the reward, until you start feeling like coffee again. And then once you buy coffee again, you may then start to have that rapid response rate until you get the reward. Whereas you look at down at the bottom, the fixed interval, you see that it's fixed because, once again, the tick marks are evenly spaced out. So after a certain period of time has passed, right, those rewards are evenly passed out. And then you see that the reward rate increases as you get closer to that little tick mark, but then it scallops. There's a pause right after the reward, right? And that shows that once they've gotten the reward, right, they got the grade that they needed, they worked really hard at the end of the quarter to get the A, that the next quarter, right, that first week, they're not trying very hard, right? They've stopped the behavior. There's a long pause in the behavior. So it shows that with fixed interval, you have a speeding up of response rate right before the reward, and then right after the reward, you have a long pause where they're not exhibiting the behavior before they begin again, right? So you have that scalloping effect. If you look at the top right, we see variable ratio. You know it's a variable because the reward tick marks are spread out in different sort of spacing. It's unpredictable, right, where those little tick marks are coming. And you notice that it is super resistant to extinction. There is no pauses, right? It's steadily going up. You see that both ratios, the response rate is very steep. The graph is steep, which means it's a really high response rate, really intense response rate in a short amount of time, right? And with variable ratio, you see that there's no pause. So think of a slot machine where people just cannot get away from the slot machine. They know that because the next time could be the reward that they're seeking, and they just can't leave it, right? Because leaving it would be like letting someone else get that reward, the next person who plays. And then if you look at the bottom right, you see variable interval. Once again, you know it's interval because the response rate is flatter, right? It's more steady, not steep. It's steady, right? And this one is just steady and not intense because they have no idea when the reward is coming. They just know it is. So in fishing, you don't do much but leave your line in the water. Or for a pop quiz, you study a little bit, make sure you're somewhat ready, but you don't cram because you have no idea when that quiz is coming.